First Days Amongst the Contrabands by Elizabeth Hyde Botume. Read by Frank Blissett. Chapter 3. How I Entered the Lines. Trip on Government Steamer Arago. October 25, 1864, I received the following communication. You are hereby appointed by the New England Freedmen's Aid Society a teacher of freed people at Beaufort, South Carolina. Armed with this commission, which entitled me to serve my country in the small army of teachers, sometimes lightly spoken of as Gideon's Band, and with the proper transportation papers, I reported myself on the 28th at the quartermaster's office in New York. Fortunately, my papers had been sent me direct from General Rufus Saxton, then military commander and governor of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. My passport was duly viséd, and I was advised to get on board the steamer the next morning as early as possible. Therefore, by 8 o'clock, accompanied by several friends who promised to see me off, I started for the government steamer Arago, which was to sail at noon. Notwithstanding the early hour, it was almost impossible to reach the boat. Carts, carriages, and piles of military supplies blocked the way, whilst squads of soldiers with bands of music surrounded us on all sides. At length, after much jostling and pushing and many delays as we were borne along by the crowd, we landed at the foot of the gangway. There we were suddenly ordered to halt. 2 swords were crossed in front of me as I was ahead. The way was stopped, and the word "Pass" was screamed into my ears. Immediately one of my friends thrust the passport into my hands, which, as I held it up, was hastily scrutinized by the officer in command. Soldiers with glittering bayonets stood on all sides of us. The 2 swords were raised enough for me to go under, and I was motioned forward. They were immediately dropped behind me, and my friends were ordered back. Words were of no avail, so they reached over the barrier and piled bags, bundles, and books onto my already overloaded arms, whilst vainly trying to gesticulate directions and a goodbye. One last lingering look behind, and I found myself alone, marching up the plank between a double file of soldiers, feeling very much as if I were a deserter from the ranks, or a spy, or military prisoner destitute of patriotism and bereft of courage. Arrived on deck, I was left to myself. My escort, Major Saxton, who was returning to his post with his wife and baby boy, had not yet arrived, and for a long time I was the only passenger to be seen. There was not another woman yet on board, only soldiers and officers hurrying to and fro, gesticulating and shouting unintelligible orders. I tried in vain to go below. This could not be allowed until the ranking officer came on board and the military were furnished with quarters. Civilians, and especially females, were regarded without favor. Fortunately, by the suggestion of a friend, I had provided myself with the inevitable camp stool, which now came into good use, and for a long time after did excellent service. Getting close to the side of the vessel, to be out of the way, and to avoid observation, I watched the progress of affairs for the next 3 hours. In the course of the morning, several women arrived, officers' wives, teachers, and a few belonging to the families of merchants and speculators. Not one of them could get transportation and a passport through the lines without first having a teacher's commission and pledging herself to aid in the work of education. At that time, Army regulations were very strict, as some mischievous and traitorous woman had already succeeded in getting into the military departments. In due time, my friends came on board, after which all arrangements were most happily made for me. Our passports only entitled us to transportation. Staterooms and subsistence were to be secured after we sailed, and, as the military were served in the order of their rank, of course teachers had the fag ends of everything. In some instances, the poor accommodations they did get were accorded most grudgingly. All of these arrangements were under the care of the purser and steward, over whom the captain had apparently little or no real authority. An unprotected woman without a military friend on one of these government boats had a hard time, being often rudely treated or entirely neglected by these servants. The Arago was a noble exception and a good boat. All the arrangements were as complete as it was possible to make them. But I watched with dismay the fruitless effort of some women to get a quiet corner for rest. At last, just as the city bells began to ring out 12 o'clock, we weighed anchor, and slowly began to drop down the harbor, amidst the roaring of cannon, screeching of the whistle, and shouting of the crowd on shore. Hurry, bustle, and confusion everywhere. Some persons were late, and were pulled aboard after the plank was taken in. Their boxes, bundles, and valises were recklessly thrown after them. As long as we could see and hear anything, the crowd on shore waved and hurrahed to us. How quickly the old life ended, and our new life began. Whilst the booming of the guns still rang in our ears, the purser began to place us according to rank and station. It is pleasant to recall these days of my first expedition. Before we were fairly out to sea, the quiet and order of a well-regulated family was established. People soon ceased to be strangers to each other. A common cause made all friends. At table we were placed like guests at a private party. Around us were officers and their wives who had been down before, and who had many interesting stories of camp life to tell. At my right were my friends, Major Saxton and his wife. On my left, a young surgeon in a New York regiment. Our vis-a-vis were good Dr. Marsh, chief of the Sanitary Commission in Beaufort, and his wife, and the post surgeon, Dr. Durant and Mrs. Durant. A little beyond were Mr. D.C. Wilson of the Quartermaster's Department with his family. He had been with General Saxton on the first expedition to Hilton Head, and when he first entered Beaufort. What stories were told of camp life and military experiences, full of pathos and tenderness, intermingled with ludicrous adventures. They come back to me now like the stories of Aladdin or tales of the Crusades. Half the boat was crowded with soldiers, and of course there was much speculation as to their destination. The ranking officer was non-committal. It was said that we were sailing under sealed orders, and that there were 25,000 stand-of-arms marked "Nowhere" on board, that the captain himself did not know his destination and would not get directions until we reached Fortress Monroe. Some persons thought that the steamer might be ordered back to New York, and others predicted we should be taken to New Orleans before we landed. It was whispered on deck that we had prisoners who were below to be exchanged, and our kindly sympathies were greatly aroused and much curiosity excited. There were those around us who looked wise, but said nothing, and the rest of us were left entirely in the dark. So, watching, waiting, and speculating upon coming events, the time passed until we reached Fortress Monroe. Here a large fleet was awaiting orders. We were told our steamer brought these orders, and again there was much excitement and expectation. It was just sunset, the second day out, when we anchored in Hampton Roads. For a long time we stood by the side of the vessel, watching the small boats, loaded with men, going to and from the land. Whether friends or foes we could not tell. It was too dark to distinguish anything. We could only hear the plashing of the oars, the scraping of the boat on the sands, and the sounds of suppressed voices, with occasional quick commands. All we could know was that a large number of men were taken off and others brought back, and it was whispered around that these were the prisoners to be exchanged. The calm sea and clear sky, contrasting with the excitement around us, made the night seem doubly tranquil. This unceasing activity amidst the darkness reminded us of the uncertain future to which all were hastening, and the regular ringing of the half-hour bells seemed like the knell of departing time. All the evening and well into the night we listened to the stories of the officers returning to their posts of duty. Mr. Wilson told us that on this same day, 2 years before, he sailed from Fortress Monroe with the Great Southern Expedition, a fleet of nearly 50 vessels. He gave an animated account of the incidents of that expedition, of the entrance to Port Royal Harbor, and the taking of Beaufort. Why, the Union forces did not take possession of Port Royal Island until December 5, 1861, so our troops did not fairly get to Beaufort until the 8th. It was something to see the town then. There was but one white man in it, and he was too drunk to leave. I believe he afterwards declared he feigned intoxication, not wishing to go away. He was a poor fellow anyway. In November 1861, our troops took Hilton Head, the place where this steamer is to land. Many curious and touching things happened at that time. General Drayton, who builded and commanded the fort there, had a brother who was captain in our army. He was the only one of the family who was for the Union, and he was true blue. When he went on board the rebel flagship, some of the negroes belonging to his brother recognized him and were wild with joy to see him. I believe they considered him the very personification of liberty. You ask how the negroes appeared at this time? They were dazed. Some were greatly excited, and others were terribly depressed. The superior officers, of whom General Drayton was one, reported that there was no insurrectionary feeling among the negroes. They had shown no disposition for revenge or violence. No acts of pillaging or incendiarism were reported at that time, which seems very remarkable under all circumstances. Some of the negroes refused to go up country when ordered off by their owners, which was considered unparalleled in subordination. The poor creatures were unsettled enough as they were, and they preferred to remain in the old familiar places. Who can wonder at this? A great many hid away, but when they recovered from their fright, they came from their hiding places and went to work in the fields. They had no overseer or driver, but chose one of the head men to direct and advise them. When our troops took Hilton Head Island, the fields were white with cotton ready to be picked. It was a beautiful sight, and novel to most of our men. You must read the reports of the capture of Fort Walker and Fort Beauregard. Some parts read like a romance. Fort Walker was on Hilton Head, and Fort Beauregard was on Bay Point. The extreme points of these two islands form the entrance to Port Royal Sound, which is about 3 miles wide. This sound is a wonderful harbor, where many of our gunboats are now lying. You will not be south long before you will hear about the advantages of Port Royal Harbor, for the officers and soldiers are very much impressed by it. They say it will take in the navies of the world. It is in the heart of South Carolina, and is only 20 miles from Savannah and 30 from Charleston. When our men landed on Hilton Head, the negroes guided them to the rebel officers' headquarters, which was on the Pope plantation. Here they found a very fine library. There were, besides the books, complete files of old papers, some dating as far back as 1812. Hard, wasn't it, to have all these things destroyed? These stories seemed to us, in our novel position, like leaves from history and romance. Unwritten history they certainly were. Listening, I realized more fully than ever before what struggles, feats of courage, and hours of endurance had opened the way for us and made possible our present peaceful expedition. Taking the Oath of Allegiance. At Hilton Head, we were obliged to go to the Provost Marshal's office and take the Oath of Allegiance to the best government in the world. This oath, which was read to us, and which we half-audibly repeated, was very impressive. I do solemnly swear that I will support, protect, and defend the Constitution and government of the United States against all enemies, whether domestic or foreign, that I will bear true and faithful allegiance, resolution or law of any state convention to the contrary notwithstanding. And further, that I do this with a full determination and pledge to perform it without any mental reservation whatever. And further, that I will faithfully perform all the duties which may be required of me by law. So help me God. As I held up my right hand and took the oath, I felt that I now belonged entirely to my country, to labor for that country's good. Our examination, if not over strict, was a little amusing. We were closely scrutinized by the officer, who was hurriedly writing at his desk. "What name, please? And what age shall I put down?" with a conciliatory smile. Dr. Durant patiently stood by and answered for us when he could, but the nearest of our friends would never have recognized any of us by the descriptions given in our permits. Having again raised my hand, swearing I would give no aid nor information, etc., to the enemy, I received my papers, and found myself set down as Mrs. Butters, and described as a tall lady with black hair and black eyes, etc. As not one of our number answered to this description in any way, we decided our young officer had drawn largely upon his imagination. Mrs. Wilson, who stood by my side, was very fair and delicate, and no taller than I. After this we left the Arago, and were transferred to a smaller boat bound for Beaufort, which was sent down for the officers belonging to General Saxton's command. In due time we steamed up the river, past the forts. Bay Point and the gunboats lying in Port Royal Harbor, which General Sherman calls the finest harbor that exists on the coast south of Hatteras, and landed at the wharf in Beaufort. A curious crowd of white men and Negroes stood around waiting for our boat to come up. Here we were welcomed by General Saxton and his staff, and in spite of the turmoil and confusion around us, and the insignia of war, we ceased to feel like strangers in a strange land. There were soldiers everywhere, saluting the general as we passed. Not a white woman to be seen, excepting some officers' wives, and a few teachers expecting friends, and who only appeared in public under good escort. Negroes, Negroes, Negroes. They hovered around like bees in a swarm, sitting, standing, or lying at full length, with their faces turned to the sky. Every doorstep, box, or barrel was covered with them, for the arrival of a boat was a time of great excitement. They were dressed, no, not dressed, nor clothed, but partly covered with every conceivable thing which could be put on the back of a biped. Some of the women had on old cast-off soldiers' coats with crocus bags, fastened together with their own ravelings, for skirts, and bits of sailcloth for head handkerchiefs. Many of the men had strips of gay carpeting, or old bags, or pieces of blanket, in which they cut armholes and wore as jackets. Their pants were tied below and above the knees and around the waist, with pieces of rope to keep them on. Words fail to describe their grotesque appearance. Fortunately, they were oblivious to all this incongruity. They had not yet attained distinct personality. They were only parts of a whole, once masses niggers, now refugees and contrabands. So all looked up with a smile and put their hands to their foreheads in military fashion, with a "Howdy, General, howdy, Missus," as we passed along. I was to be a guest at General Saxton's headquarters, so we went directly there. This was a large and fine private residence, formerly the property of a wealthy Southerner, now called Secesh. At the large gate was a sentinel's box, before which stood a black sentinel, who gave us the military salute as we passed through. At the top of the high steps we were received by two black orderlies, who escorted us to the family rooms. All the lower part of the great house was used for military purposes. It was camp life within doors. All night long I was aroused by the sentinel tramping under my window, calling out the hours with the voice of a stentor. 12 o'clock and all is well, or 1 o'clock and all is well, giving rhythmical cadence to each word. Now and then he would bring his gun to the ground with a sharp clang, and call out, "Who comes there?" After which the unceasing tramp, tramp, tramp would begin again. Soon I ceased to be a stranger. I began to feel great security as I listened to this steady march and monotonous call. I had a sense of watchfulness and protection never experienced before. Stay in Beaufort. I had heard of the wonderful climate of the Sea Islands. I was told it was almost perpetual sunshine there, as a rainstorm rarely lasted more than 12 hours. But it rained 3 days constantly after my arrival. During that time I had opportunity to learn something of military life. The town of Beaufort was filled to overflowing with ex-slaves or freed people, who were always spoken of as contrabands. They had flocked here from every direction, from the plantations not far away, from up country, and down south. Every boat that came in from any direction brought a cargo of fugitives. When Beaufort was taken, Officer DuPont reported, "The inhabitants have fled, and the town is abandoned to the negroes, who are reported to me to be in a lawless condition. They were wild with joy and revenge. They have been shot down, they say, like dogs, because they would not go off with their masters. The Confederates were in an utter panic. They deserted everything." This was when the Union gunboats reached the town after taking Hilton Head. Captain Rogers also reported at this time. "Beaufort has been taken by the gunboats, the town having been abandoned by the whites. The negroes were pillaging the town. They said the whites were shooting them right and left in order to drive them back into the interior." Some people who came off in a boat to the Seneca said, "One man shot 6 of the negroes." There were those in town who bore the marks of the cruel treatment they had received, and who spoke with horror and with hatred of the burning of their houses and the killing of the slaves. The first Sunday after my arrival, we went to the campground and heard Chaplain Lynch, a colored man, preach to the soldiers. The brigade was drawn up in line in front of General Saxton and his staff, whilst hundreds of contrabands were hovering around, a mottled and grotesque background to the bright military display. As I stood upon the platform and looked down upon this crowd of black faces, I was thrilled with astonishment at their intense earnestness. They were huddled together as close as possible, quiet and subdued, but not dejected. All eyes were fixed upon the speaker with great solemnity. I began then to realize the importance of the duties we owed to the poor, ignorant ex-slaves. These were the people I had come to teach and to help. I had left all behind for their sakes, and I was impatient to begin. Each hour showed me, too, that at the North we had but a faint conception of the work to be done. Old Fort Plantation. I found my location was to be at Old Fort Plantation, a place of historic renown and great beauty. A large number of colored refugees had been brought here. These were part of the 800 brought off by General Montgomery on his raid to Combahee. As poor and destitute a class of human beings as could possibly be found, for whom my sympathies had already been strongly aroused. Dr. Marsh had warned me against these people, assuring me, "The slaves on the rice plantations were the most degraded of the race," and he considered them the connecting link between human beings and the brute creation. As this was purely a missionary work, these were the people I wished to come in contact with. I wanted to learn what could be done with the lowest of God's creatures. My subsequent experiences in teaching the freed people proved that the good doctor was wrong in his estimate of their character and condition. I found those from the mainland more intelligent and better bred than the mass of those from the islands. Sunday afternoon I drove in an ambulance down to the old plantation. My road lay along the river bank, which was thickly bordered by large oaks and tall pine trees. We passed through one or two plantations abandoned to the Negroes, and past the Contraband village, a collection of low buildings called by the people themselves Montgomery Hill. Why a hill I could never learn, as there was not the slightest perceptible elevation. All the people, men, women, and children, came out to greet us, with bows, scrapings of the feet, courtesies, and a general shouting of, "How do ye, missus? How do ye? Us glad to see you na. How's all de folks when you left 'em?" This last inquiry they consider a special mark of respect, and one they never forget. The plantation house at which we stopped, and which was to be my future home, was one of the oldest on the island. It was a low, two-storied mansion, built in a wonderful grove of live oaks and water oaks, which covered an area of 60 acres. All these trees are heavily draped with the long gray moss, which is never found in greater luxuriance than on and around the sea islands. It hung dank and heavy from the recent rains, and as we entered the grove this bright summer afternoon, the place seemed like a solemn, grand old cathedral. The house contained 9 small rooms. The outside door opened into a medium-sized apartment, which was called the hall, but had always been used as parlor and dining room. Out of this opened a butler's pantry and buttery, which enclosed one end of the open piazza. At the other was an office or waiting room. There was, adjoining this, a small room which the servants designated as drawing room. A door opened from this room directly upon a narrow front piazza, from which there was a pleasant view of the broad river and of the islands beyond. A narrow flight of winding stairs led up outside from the back piazza to a small square entry, from which 4 doors opened into the bedrooms. The kitchen and laundry and servants' rooms were in separate buildings. A row of these houses faced the back entrance. Not far away and in plain sight were the Negro Quarters, a row of small houses placed diagonally where the field hands lived. In front of the house was an avenue of magnolias leading to the river, which was bordered with a thick hedge of Spanish daggers, or bayonets, the Yucca filamentosa. When the war broke out, this place was mentioned as Smith's Plantation, taking its name from the old owner. On one of the posts of the front piazza was found some writing, supposed to be by the former owner. It said for more than 40 years he had moved from this place to his house in town and back again, making the change over 80 times, and he devoutly thanked God for all the blessings he had received. It seemed indescribably pathetic to me, thus to walk into a stranger's house and take quiet possession. There was nothing within to remind one of the original owner. It was only when I walked around and saw the carefully arranged grounds, with fine shrubs and vines and graveled walks bordered with flowers, that I realized what the place had been. In spite of years of neglect, for it was first left to the care of the Negroes, and then taken by the Union troops and used for soldiers' barracks and hospitals, in spite of all this, there was much beauty left. As I walked around, I was more and more overwhelmed by a realization of the cruel necessities of a civil war. Old Fort. The old fort which gave its name to this plantation was built in 1562. Parts of it are still standing, showing the spot where Captain Jean Ribault and his party landed. Captain Landonniere described this place in his History de la Floride. Large trees growing on top of the sea wall stand as witness of its antiquity. In this history, Landonniere gave a fine description of the harbor, saying, "A raison de sa beauté et grandeur fut appelée Port Royal," which name it has always held, avec raison. From the banks of the river, which is a broad arm of the sea, I could distinctly see the Union gunboats lying peacefully at anchor at Bay Point and Port Royal Harbor. My first night spent in this old deserted plantation house was full of troubled dreams. The novel and isolated position, with remembrances of the stories I had been listening to of its past and recent history, with the sighing of the wind and dashing of the waves against the shore as the tide came in, all combined to weave around me strange and fantastic visions. But the early morning brought a healthy reaction, for there was work enough to do. Like soldiers, we had come with our knapsacks in our hands. We were to live on soldiers' rations and draw our supplies from the commissariat. In army fashion, we formed a mess. To each member of this was delegated some special duties, and each one in turn took charge and looked after supplies. But the we, I mean a young man from Massachusetts, who was superintendent of that part of the island, and a young woman sent out by the New York Society, and who had charge of the plantation school. The house was stripped of all furniture. The windows were without curtains, and had only board shutters to protect us from the sun by day and unwelcome intrusion at night. When these shutters were closed, we were in absolute darkness. When they were open, the windows were so shattered there was nothing to protect us from the wind and the weather. There were no domestic utensils. A few articles of household furniture had been gathered together for our immediate use. This place was first deserted by its owners, then stripped of every movable thing by the negroes, and then entirely devastated by the soldiers. We were not quite so bad off as a friend who went south with the first band of missionaries in 1862. His first location was on a plantation on St. Helena Island. He had no culinary utensils but a large iron tea kettle and a small frying pan, and there was nothing else to be found far or near. So he first boiled his eggs in the tea kettle, then he boiled fresh water, to which he added his coffee. He baked bread in his pan until he learned to bake hoe cakes on a real hoe before an open fire. He roasted potatoes in the ashes and fried the bacon when the bread was done. These were all his resources for many weeks. Then a Negro woman brought him a small hominy pot, so he could add this universal and nutritious edible to his bill of fare. We were better off than this, as the lapse of time had brought a little order out of chaos, and we were near the base of supplies. Our house was a cheerless place at first. It took time and patience to bring around us anything like homely comforts. 3 times a day our rations were spread upon a solid mahogany table, a relic of secesh times, too big and heavy to be carried away. We drew up our camp stools to this festive board, and enjoyed our repast as only tired, busy, and hungry people can. Table linen was voted out as too great a luxury in wartime to be indulged in. I had brought with me a bed sack, which was filled with corn husks, and never was rest more grateful than I found on this after a hard day's work. That was Chapter 3, How I Entered the Lines, from First Days Amongst the Contrabands, by Elizabeth Hyde Botume. Read by Frank Blissett.